My name is Mona Gleason, and I'm a professor in the Department of Educational Studies here in the Faculty of Education. And I teach and research in two main areas that are really connected. One is the history of children and childhood, and the other is the history of education. My research in the history of children and childhood began many, many years ago, decades ago. And at that time, in the context of Canada, there was very little work being done on the history of babies, toddlers. There was some work on the history of early childhood education, for sure, but a broad take on the area of, what was it like to grow up in the past? What was it like to, how were babies and young children treated in the past there was very minimal knowledge being produced in those areas. So I was really interested to understand and to sort of open up the field in Canada. And one of the first projects that I undertook was a history of not so much babies, but attitudes towards young people in the sense of mothering advice. So in the 19th century in Canada, like many other places around the world, there were a lot of, mostly men, to be honest, medical professionals sort of telling mothers how to do their job, what babies needed, what they were like. And I found this really, really fascinating. So I built my first few projects looking at parenting advice and mothering advice for babies. And I kind of expanded that when some years later, when I looked at more general parenting advice around young children. More recently, I've completed a study that became one of the first studies in the Canadian context on children's medical treatment. So from infants right up to kind of adolescence. And I wanted to try to foster understanding about how young people themselves experienced medical treatment. So I undertook a whole big series of oral history interviews about people to see if they could remember things. I did a lot of looking at old medical textbooks, a whole range of kind of historical sources. So my work in the earlier periods and kind of into the middle of my career really had to do with establishing the fact that young people do have a history, including toddlers and young children, and they're historical actors. They contribute to change over time, perhaps in ways that we're not really well versed in thinking about. But, when you have a room full of small children, they have some power. They typically have power. So I thought their voices and experiences need to be included in sort of a more broader social history of Canada and other contexts around the world. As a historian, looking for evidence of young people in the past is really challenging, as you can imagine. It's one thing to try to find out how people with some stature lived in the past, but to find remnants of people who were really quite powerless is definitely a challenge. So historians typically use many, many, many different kinds of sources to pull together a picture of what it was like to live in the past. So my work often begins in the archives, in the historical archive. And so, for example, I have spent a great deal of time at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, and they actually do have an archive, or did. They may have stopped it by now, but they had a wonderful archive there that I could look at actual files of children and babies to figure out what was the actual daily experience for them in the hospital. So, archival research, I would look at anything I could get my hands on, to be honest. Advice to parents, public health, nursing, any advice manuals that they would produce. So historical work is kind of like detective work. You kind of have to be inventive about what sources might reflect something interesting about people who and young babies, young children who typically would leave no trace of themselves as they grew out of their condition of being a child. One of the biggest like shifts I experienced as a researcher happened when I got pregnant. Actually, when I actually had children, when I had a baby, or became a mother, that really changed how I thought about the issues that I was looking at historically. Previous to that, I was doing work in the area, but I just found after I became, responsible for a life in front of me, and also a lot of demands about how this young life should unfold. A lot of advice, as I've mentioned before, a lot of oversight by government, by the state, by schools, by other family members. So, your child is of course yours, but in some interesting ways, as they grow up, they become this public child that interacts with people outside of yourself. They go to the store, they get on the bus. So, yeah, I would have to say it was having a baby, and that really made me ask, I think, different questions about the past. It made me understand how difficult it is to, rewarding, absolutely, but also quite difficult. These roles that we have vis-a-vis really young children, they're often or can be seen as, oh, just second nature, very easy to look after little kids. That's not the case at all. They're they're a difficult audience. And so, yeah, I really valued that experience as a mother because it directly impacted my research. I think that historical work could probably play a larger role in early child education programs, even though I know that, in the Faculty of Education at UBC's program, historical work's very valued. And I've always felt, really lucky to be working with students who are interested in early childhood. They're very receptive to understanding, the trends over centuries about where we've come to be here now. I think in the field, it's in my field more, perhaps a little bit more of the historical side. I think that there's sort of two trends. One's a very broad, much broader trend. One is a narrower trend that I have seen over the years. One is an increasing appreciation for and understanding that historical change doesn't just happen at the top with powerful politicians or, other kinds of powerful people. That historical change is very incremental, and it begins with very small changes. It begins in families, and that, families changing their priorities and directions in order to make sure that their children thrive tells you something about the power of children to shift people's lives, right? So that's sort of a bigger picture. The smaller picture that I see happening in my field, and it's been a while happening, but it's becoming more and more such wonderful work coming out constantly on childhood that is could be considered a marginalized childhood. So Black children, children of color, broadly conceived, Indigenous childhoods and children, and children with disabilities. So all of those stories and those experiences that have been over the years overlooked are now being front and center. And so, for those kind of histories, again, historians have to be very creative in looking for the sources around those experiences because they're often, of course, marginalized, hidden. But some really exciting directions are starting to be forged, even in the Canadian context, around, for example, Indigenous childhoods and Indigenous ways of raising children that are very, very, on one hand, no longer being marginalized and actually coming back to the center in some ways. So it's been an interesting kind of full circle moment.